this massive map of Russia. Sweep your eyes across territories spanning 2 continents, and then zoom in. Zoom all the way in on a tiny, battered dot in southern Ukraine. Welcome to Tokmachka, a farming village exactly 8 square kilometers in size. With a pre-war population of barely 3,000 people, who would have thought that this microscopic speck on the map would become the graveyard for the ego of a military superpower? They have thrown thousands of lives in here, hundreds of armored vehicles, and burned through 1,500 days of relentless siege just trying to swallow this piece of land. And yet, they are completely powerless. The harsh reality is, that giant war machine broke its teeth, biting into a dry bone. Ironically, to salvage their shattered pride. Their propaganda machine had to go on national television, desperately comparing this middle-of-nowhere village to the legendary Battle of Troy or Verdun. Just think about it. 8 square kilometers. The Battle of Troy. How pathetic. Step into the neon-lit, cigar smoke-filled command rooms in Moscow, where the generals stand with hands on their hips in front of massive maps. They draw thick, brilliant red arrows, curving smoothly like a torrential flood ready to swallow southern Ukraine. The delusional masterpiece they sketched for the 2025 to 2026 campaign was the pincer movement, a textbook military classic. The plan was painted so magnificently that even a child could see its supposed greatness. In that macro-strategic vision, the village of Tokmachka was positioned as the western gate. Russian forces absolutely had to kick this gate down, flood through to flank, seal the encirclement, and completely choke out the Orikhiv stronghold. Ironically, these genius minds believed unconditionally in a beautiful domino effect, where everything would collapse exactly as they programmed. Just think about it. Their algorithm was painfully simple. Step 1. Flatten Tokmachka. Step 2. Swallow Orikhiv whole. Once the Orikhiv knot breaks, the massive city of Zaporizhzhia, a mere 37 kilometers away, would be stripped of its defensive shield, exposing itself like a delicious prey waiting on the chopping block. If that scenario succeeded, Russia would permanently nail down and secure the M14 logistics highway. That is the vital umbilical cord pumping blood and ammunition straight to the Crimean peninsula. To put it bluntly, these gentlemen painted a vision so glorious that they probably chuckled in their sleep every night, utterly convinced that this chess game was already won, and all they had to do was sit back smugly and wait for the harvest. But the battlefield is not a cozy, air-conditioned room, and soldiers' blood is not ink on a map. The harsh reality is, that strategic domino chain was brutally swept off its feet and smashed to pieces right at the very first stone. The Western Army Group, carrying so much ambition to shred the enemy lines, never advanced a single step. Not 1 millimeter. That entire formidable force was humiliatingly locked down at this 8 square kilometer gate. Their faces must have been like, completely unable to comprehend how on earth a farming village could chew up their most elite tank divisions. It turns out, drawing an arrow across a map takes 3 seconds, but taking a single step across the fields of Tokmachka cost them an entire bloody campaign and left them completely empty-handed. The strategists sat with their feet on the desk, calculating moves as smoothly as playing a video game, but entirely forgot that a cheap padlock on the ground was enough to shatter an entire tactical system. The price they have to pay is that their proud red arrow snapped in half so humiliatingly, turning their grand chess game into a pathetic joke, so bitterly embarrassing that nobody even bothers to clean up the ruins. Now, let's put aside the grandiose rhetoric and look straight into the cold, hard numbers. Because to put it bluntly, in the eyes of war oligarchs, human lives are nothing but a simple math problem of addition and subtraction. Around the Orikhiv stronghold, the number of confirmed dead bodies has surpassed 5,300. Right at this middle-of-nowhere farming village of Tokmachka alone, Russia has tossed over 2,000 lives into the mud. Just think about it. 2,000 human beings crushed just to trade for 8 square kilometers of wasteland. A chillingly cheap exchange. The harsh reality is that their proud meatwave tactic has gone completely bankrupt. The Kremlin's troop-grinding algorithm is throwing massive errors as the human attrition rate spiked to 316 soldiers per square kilometer. which is a 163% increase compared to 2025. But once the meat grinder starts spinning, it knows no end. The misery is, their recruitment machine scrapes together 940 new conscripts to send to the front line every single day. And yet, the death machine chews up over 1,140 soldiers in that same time frame. A daily deficit of 200 human lives. Who would have thought that an army that used to pound its chest, calling itself the second most powerful in the world, would have to play this bleeding dry game to such an extent? And the most ridiculous part, the peak of absurdity happened in March 2026, when data revealed that 96% of Russian casualties were not caused by heroic gunfights or majestic artillery barrages, but by drones. Their faces must have been like, completely stunned in disbelief, seeing their massive troop formations ripped apart by a flying toy hovering above their heads. Ironically, they tried to use the sheer weight of human flesh and blood to crush their opponent. But in the end, that pile of meat was chopped to pieces by soulless machines made of plastic and metal, buzzing in the sky for just a few tens of thousands of dollars. The price they have to pay is an entire generation of young men wiped out by cheap drones whose parts you can literally buy online. The generals sitting in their ivory towers just kept begging for a little more time, demanding to throw a few thousand more lives into the furnace, hoping to turn the tide. It turns out, Tokmachka generously granted them a grueling 1,500 days and piles of thousands of dead bodies, but all that blood was still never enough to lubricate a war machine that was already rusted and rotting straight from its core. Honestly, November 2025, cameras rolling, polished podium. Defense Minister Andrei Belousov stands tall, chest full of medals, loudly declaring to the whole world that his army had completely liberated Tokmachka. A grand victory, indeed. A shining milestone in their special military operation. And yet, this cheap, epic movie was brutally cut off, right in the middle. Just a mere few days after that chest-thumping moment of pride, pro-Russian sources on social media had to humiliatingly swallow their own words, bitterly admitting to a harsh truth that fierce fighting continues. It turns out, that PR stunt bit its masters right back, turning into a dizzying slap right to the faces of the top brass on national television, leaving the whole crew so petrified they didn't know which crack in the ground to hide their faces in to ease the humiliation. Seriously. Who would have thought that the minister's eloquent declaration would so quickly turn into a pathetic comedy act on the internet? The misery is, Tokmachka was no longer simply a military target. It had officially evolved into a massive, mocking meme, striking critical blows directly at the fragile ego of the Kremlin. Across forums, people dragged that battered 8-square-kilometer area out as a yardstick to measure the unmatched might of the world's second superpower. Their faces must have been completely petrified and turning purple, seeing millions openly laughing at them. The harsh reality is, when an empire cannot win on the battlefield with guns and bullets, they turn to flexing on their own unarmed citizens. And the absolute peak of patheticness arrived. It was when Russian universities had to frantically send out notices, threatening to expel any student who dared to bring up the name Tokmachka to mock it online. Just think about it. A nation that proudly pounds its chest for possessing thousands of nuclear warheads, holding hypersonic weapons that could flatten an entire continent, ultimately having to cowardly go bully some freshmen over an internet meme. To put it bluntly, their pride is as fragile and easily broken as a cheap glass cup from a flea market. Ironically, the more they try to use their power to gag the public, the more their impotence is exposed in the most naked and ridiculous way possible. The price they have to pay is the absolute stripping of a massive military machine's dignity, left completely tossed aside in a field of muddy garbage, only for that supreme power. They fantasized about every night to collapse disastrously just because of a few mocking internet memes. Looking back, it's honestly a cheap comedy so laughable it's bitter. February 2026. The battlefield was in a bloody stalemate when a shocking event occurred. Not from an earth-shattering artillery barrage, not from some secret weapon, but from some trivial, invisible thing. the Starlink connection for the entire Russian military suddenly went pitch black. Who would have thought that a massive command system, which had been screaming orders to deploy troops, would completely collapse overnight just because they lost their internet connection? It turns out, all that majestic swagger evaporated into thin air just because the router lights went out, turning a notorious army into a bunch of clueless scarecrows standing frozen in the middle of the battlefield. Like, seriously? And yet, in modern warfare, being blind to information equals death. The Ukrainian army, of course, did not miss this gift falling from the sky. They surged forward to counterattack, sweeping back 480 square kilometers of territory without almost needing to fire a single bullet. The misery is, the Russian army at that moment was exactly like a swarm of blind ants, trampled to a pulp before they could even understand what the hell was happening. By May 2026, that bloody 8 square kilometer patch of Mala Tokmachka obediently returned to Ukrainian hands. The harsh reality is that Kyiv's largest territorial gain in over 2 years originated from a fateful unplugged Wi-Fi cord, only for the irony to reach its absolute peak when a simple disconnection mouse click was more than enough to overturn a bloody 1,000-day campaign of a military superpower. Just think about it. The generals poured billions of dollars into buying tanks, hypersonic missiles, pounding their chests, claiming to be invincible. But their faces must have been like utterly blank and in extreme panic upon realizing that their entire grand war machine had turned into a pile of useless scrap metal just because they lacked Wi-Fi bars. The might of a superpower, it turns out, only lasts until their internet data plan expires. Ironically, the concept of a backfire struck in the most humiliating way possible. The army that once arrogantly marched to liberate another country was now pushed all the way back to the banks of the Yankee River. To put it bluntly, they are stuck there like rats in a trap. Behind them is a freezing river. In front of them are the gun barrels of the Ukrainian army. And right above their heads are swarms of drones buzzing, waiting to drop grenades. Their situation right now is exactly like hiding behind a tiny concrete wall in the middle of a vast empty field, shivering and waiting for the Grim Reaper to call their names. The price they have to pay is that tens of thousands of elite troops have officially transitioned from arrogant hunters into pathetic creatures begging just to survive the day. And when that internet connection dropped, the delusional pride of an empire was also flushed straight down the drain, wrapping up a humiliating tragicomedy whose remnants nobody even bothers to pick up. Like, literally now, the chessboard of southern Ukraine has only 2 scenarios left. And, to put it bluntly, both are blood-soaked and reek of death for the sleepwalking hunters. Either the Ukrainian army will continue to thrust deep into Tokmachka and Melitopol, tearing the defensive lines apart to completely sever the vital artery leading to Crimea. Or they will just leave this rotting front line exactly as it is, leisurely sitting back and operating cheap drone swarms to grind down Russian forces minute by minute. The misery is, no matter which path is chosen, southern Ukraine has officially transformed into a living hell, trapping these unlucky expeditionary forces. Who would have thought that the tank divisions that once paraded grandly, shaking Red Square, would now have to huddle in the mud, looking up at the sky in absolute terror at every single buzz of a drone? The harsh reality is, the entire grand strategy to protect Putin's logistical umbilical cord connecting to Crimea has become utterly stuck, rotting, and decaying in some reckless, no-name village. Just think about it. The grand military history they intended to write to intimidate the world has now turned into a comedic, indelible stain. Their faces must have been like swallowing the bitterest pill, choking on their own frustration upon realizing that thousands of lives and billions of dollars evaporated cleanly just to trade for a pile of shattered rubble with absolutely zero strategic value. But modern military history always has the most cruel ways to punish delusional arrogance. Ironically, people used to chant and whisper to each other that if you just give the Russian army enough time and throw them enough human lives, that meat-grinding machine will break every ounce of resistance in this world. It turns out, the battlefield of Mala Tokmachka generously granted them a grueling 1,500 days, along with thousands of corpses filling the trenches. only for the price they have to pay for all that blood and illusion to be the entire pride of a massive empire, permanently buried under the mud of an 8-square-kilometer farm. Closing a tragedy so ridiculously pathetic that absolutely no one even bothers to shed a single tear of pity.